I know that we're all looking forward to a talk from my friend and colleague, Mr. Derek Harvey, who is co-director with Dr. David Jacobson of the Global Initiative on Civil Society and Conflict. The Global Initiative is an exciting center at USF that produces research and analysis, convenes workshops and seminars, hosts public and private events, and is constantly developing innovative and thoughtful solutions to some pressing social problems. Housed within the College of Arts and Sciences, this center has brought together leading academics, former government officials, policymakers, and analysts to produce comprehensive analysis of the changing dynamics in West Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and all over the world. And part of the GI team includes Derek Harvey, who is our speaker this evening. Derek is a retired United States Army colonel and the first director of the Afghanistan-Pakistan Center of Excellence at US Central Command, CENTCOM, and he was personally selected by General David Petraeus in 2009 to lead this new organization. He is also a senior executive service member of the Defense Intelligence Agency and was the previous senior analytical specialist for Iraq to General Petraeus, who was then commander of multinational forces in Iraq. He further served as a Middle East Foreign Affairs officer with numerous assignments in the region, including in Iraq. His academic training is in Middle East studies and Islamic law and political thought. And as I'm sure many of you have seen over the past few months, he's been a regular guest on leading media outlets around the world. One of the reasons that Derek is here tonight is because as universities change, as militaries change, as governments change, we are finding that we all share the same mission. And that mission is to work together to try to get the contextual information to live peacefully with one another, which is why we hired Derek as our very first professor of practice in the College of Arts and Sciences, and why I'm so pleased to introduce Mr. Derek Harvey to you right now.
Thank you, Dean Eisenberg, and thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to this talk tonight, and I hope I don't disappoint you. This is a very big issue that we have, and I'd like to first acknowledge Dr. Jacobson, who I began working with several years ago, who's the founder of the Global Initiative. And he and I work together, and he's developed partnerships with CENTCOM and Special Operations Command here, and he's brought a tremendous amount of energy and innovation to the academic life at the University of South Florida. I'd like to underscore what Dean Eisenberg noted about the Global Initiative, providing academic scholarship and policy analysis through original methodologies and delivering these to a range of different audiences, from academia to the U.S. government, to policymakers and thought leaders, and to business leaders, and our engagement with journalists to help explain what's going on in the world. We are asking difficult questions and providing innovative answers, and I am pleased to announce tonight that we have a new program which we are launching at the Global Initiative, and it is called the Global Citizens Forum. It is an online video platform headed by my colleague, Duriya Badani, to highlight the positive contributions which citizens are making to impact their local and global communities. And I hope all of you will become involved in that effort. Now, tonight's talk is titled Beyond Crisis and Conflict Towards a Deeper Understanding of the Middle East. And I know that is slightly different from the title that's in your brochures. I think that more accurately captures the talk tonight, because without a deeper understanding of the region, we will not be able to get to the right answers to at least begin to shape our responses to influencing the outcomes in the region in a wide range of areas. You know, I think that when a person gets a fever and they go and see a doctor, you first have to treat that high fever, but you also have to understand what is going on that might be causing the fever. So you have to get the fever down. But the doctor has to do a diagnosis to determine what is the disease and what are the chronic issues that might be affecting the person. You need to understand if there's cancer and if there's other aggravations and what the medical history is in order to understand how to treat that person. That is what we're trying to do in the Global Initiative, because we are focused very often on the symptoms of what's going on. The Islamic State and the crisis in the Middle East today is a reflection of underlying currents and troubles in that body politic of the Middle East. And so we're going to talk about what's going on to try and illuminate that and provide a window into what is transpiring in that important region of the world. Now, Madeleine Albright recently said that the world is a mess. And the quote up here from Frank Steinmeier, the foreign minister of Germany, and for those who can't read it, I'll read it. Looking at the crisis spanning the Maghreb, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, many perceive that the world is coming loose from its moorings. Crisis and conflict are creeping closer to Europe, and certainties that have prevailed for 25 years since the end of the Cold War have lost their hold. And we've seen similar comments from others, from the chairman, from Secretary Kerry, to even the Pope talking about the world being involved in a third world war once again, with criminality, violence, terrorism, militias, and brutality being unleashed in the world. So I'm asked often, what the heck is going on? And it's a difficult answer. And over the next 30 minutes, I hope to try to explain a little bit and get beyond the headlines of what is going on in the Middle East. It's depressing, and it's grim, and in some ways it's frightening, particularly with the videos in the media that you can see about the violence and brutality that is happening in places like Iraq, Iran, Syria, and elsewhere in the region. So, this is a strange place to inject a Dali picture. And I begin by asking you to look at this painting, because when we consider this closely, we see disparate, discrete things. And anybody who's been to the Dali Museum knows that there's usually a piano, there's an element in there of his wife, and there are other things that are very symbolic of where it was painted, and there are things that he always has in every photo. But when we step back for a moment and consider it from afar away, you see unequivocally a portrait of Abraham Lincoln. And when you're at the museum, you can see that. Up close, you see one thing. When you step back, you will see something very different. I see the Middle East similarly today. From up close, we see only the unceasing violence, the conflict, the brutality, and the increasing fractionalization. But if we step back, we'll get a more holistic view, and the picture is much clearer. When we view the Middle East, this is not about Samuel Huntington's famously noted clash of civilizations, but much more so a reflection of the failures of leadership, failures of governance, rule of law, and the lack of a vibrant civil society. Appreciating the art and understanding are two different things. Similarly, for trying to understand other peoples, other lands, cultures, and countries. The questions arise from the perspective that you take and how they inform your policy. And so I think we need to be focused on understanding the illness in the body, the chronic diseases, and what is really going on, and not focus just on the fever or the symptom. We didn't understand that black box of Iraq when we went into it in 2003, and we paid the price over the last decade plus. The Global Initiative, the intent for our studies is to understand the language, the culture, the social fabric of a society, and the political nature of the people that we're dealing with. The seeds of failure in strategy and in policy are in how you define the problem at the beginning. And if you don't do the homework to really understand it, you're going to wind up with errors in policy. And bureaucracies get locked in, and leaders get locked in. And very often, you do not change the policy unless there's another election. So, moving on from this, just a few comments here about conflict and war. Because if we look back 100 years to 1914, people thought that we were at a time of great optimism and wars between major powers were over. Because of global interconnectedness, the advancing civilization, because of trade and technology, they thought that the days of war were over, that it didn't make sense that rational actors would command the scene. Yet within a year, we were immersed in a world war. Similarly, at the end of the Cold War, we had books written about and editorials about the end of history, and we're emerging now on the new frontier of peace and tranquility in the world with a unipolar world. And now suddenly we're immersed in a world with persistent conflict and challenges to the liberal order. And balance of power is frayed, and when the balance of power is frayed and the United States is withdrawing, or perceived to be withdrawing from more and more places in the world, it creates opportunities for other nations that aspire to other things and are driven by nationalism in their own interest. And it's during this shift that miscalculations quite often occur and you have violence. And it's during this period when the balance in regions like the Middle East become unstable, and it unleashes the forces that have been suppressed for some time. And so we wind up with major conflict, quite often unexpected, like we've seen in Ukraine, and earlier this century, when we were struck on 9/11, who thought we'd be fighting two land wars in the Middle East and Central Asia for the better part of this century already? No one did. Now, conflict is about politics, and for many of you here who have been involved in politics, politics is about people. And so we're focused on understanding the population and civil societies. And people make the same decisions that they've made for 2,500 years since the Peloponnesian Wars. People fight wars and enter into conflict for honor, for greed, for power, for influence and authority. And that hasn't changed over time. But conflict and war has changed with technology. The character of war has changed. And we've seen that especially with the advancements of unmanned aerial vehicles and the democratization of weapons to more and more groups that are just coming off the shelves of Radio Shack and being converted into weapons by terrorist groups and criminal gangs. Conflict adversaries today involve criminal groups, narcotics groups, irregular forces, militias, and terrorists. That's the dominant thing that we see, whether it's in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia. And these groups are exploiting unstable and stressed human environments. And many of these areas are what are called ungoverned areas. But they're not ungoverned. They're governed by these groups, the irregulars, the terrorists. They could be the Taliban. They could be the gangs in Mexico. But they govern, they tax, they deliver services, and they're replacing the central government. Now, to take a step back just a little bit, there are some global trends that are impacting the Middle East and other parts of the world. Briefly, we've had a doubling of the population from 1750 to 1900. 750 million to 1.5 billion, and you can see the numbers, 1.5 to 3 billion, 1960 to 99, in 39 years, it doubled again. And in 15 years, it grew by 1.5 billion in 2014, and it's estimated to be up to 10 billion in 2050, just over 35 years from now. And almost all of that growth is going to be in the Middle East, Africa, Mexico and Central America, and in South Asia. And those are the areas that, for the most part, have problems with governance, rule of law, poor and underdeveloped civil society, and they have poor infrastructure and underserved education and those types of things. And those stresses and strains are just going to be further aggravated. And then if you look at the demographic trends, a youth bulge. In the Middle East, 60% of the population is 24 years of age or younger. And it's a higher percentage in countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan, where in Pakistan, it's 66% of the population is 24 years of age or younger. And the youth are connected to the world through media and social media and technology, and they have higher and higher expectations. And they need jobs, they need education, they need infrastructure, and these societies need sewer, water, electricity, education, transportation. And so you can see how this begins to become an aggravator in these communities. Urbanization. 75% of the world will be living in massive cities and massive urbanized areas by 2050. That's 75%, with more and more migration into these urbanized areas. And we're going to have megacities, which are going to be filled with ungoverned areas similar to Mogadishu or Karachi today, where the central government and the provincial governments do not control and enforce anything in those areas. And we see that increasingly in places like Mexico, El Salvador, and elsewhere. It's not just a Middle East issue. And then the last thing is literalization, meaning the populations are going to be on the coast, in megacities, and along the major tributaries of the rivers entering into those larger bodies of water. And that has implications. And we can talk about that as we go forward. A few other global trends that are intersecting with the population and the demographic issues. Connectivity and social media are bringing changes to this youth bulge, to governance, to how people think and act in the world as individuals and groups. And it's having a dynamic effect. And we don't quite understand it yet, and that's part of what we're studying. But it's connected also to technological advancements that are allowing rapid distribution of information and a diffusion of power that in itself is undermining governance at the state and local level in many of these countries. And just think about how social media is being used by the Islamic State or other groups, to disseminate information rapidly, artfully, and be able to work around all the sophisticated blocking attempts by Google and Yahoo and state government enterprises. And these groups know how to encrypt, and they know how to disseminate, and they know how to make their narrative mean something to this youth bulge that is disaffected and frustrated. And you don't have to reach all of them. All you have to do is reach a small segment in order to be able to mobilize them to your cause. And that creates real problems for the civilized world. And the last thing is democratization of military capabilities. And it's not just AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades. It is unmanned aerial vehicles being used by the Islamic State, gangs in Mexico, groups in northern Africa, even with Boko Haram in Nigeria. They're using robotics to deliver munitions, explosives. They're using iPads, smartphones, Google Earth mapping, and integrating all of this into sophisticated command and control. They're connected to the international banking system in very sophisticated ways that is making it very hard for our Treasury Department, Department of Justice, and international banking regimes to monitor, control, and be able to designate to go after their resources and assets. These are sophisticated sub-state enterprises that are able to leverage this technology that is off the shelf. So, those are global trends that we're thinking about as how they intersect with the issues that we're grappling with. Now, Thinking about the Middle East and areas of interest, just over the last 90 days, these are the things that have been driving us. We had the Gaza campaign, 50 days of war, 10,000 people injured, hundreds killed on one side, and massive destruction to buildings and infrastructure in Gaza. And on the other side, a loss of only 70 people. We've had the Syrian civil war entering its 4th year and the spillover affecting the region, with the Islamic State launching its operations from sanctuary in Syria and gobbling up most of the Sunni Arab provinces in Iraq and committing genocide and brutality of unimaginable scale in that country. Libya continues to fracture and have civil war, and it's spilling over into other states in the region. Yemen and Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula continues to remain a force and is connecting to the Islamic State and others. Pakistan, ungoverned areas being challenged by the Taliban, as well as the Baluchi resistance movement, and not being able to control major cities like Karachi. And it has a xenophobic character to it, and is in competition with India, and has a first-use nuclear posture, and is driven by a very strident form of nationalism, and it's ripe for miscalculation in its competition in that area of the world with India that isn't really invested in this competition with Pakistan because it is more invested in developing its economic potential, the potential of its human population, and the challenges that it's facing from China. Afghanistan, I think everyone knows, is in political crisis. We don't know where that is heading, but it is a potential serious problem to destabilize the region in the future. And I could go on downward with Boko Haram and the hashtag campaign to support our girls that were taken, about 200 of them, who are still missing. And Boko Haram continues to expand its reach and take more and more territory, and the government in Nigeria is unable to squelch it. And Boko Haram exists and survives because of poor governance, poor institutional capacity, lack of connection to the global system, and a lack of an education system and preparedness for that youth population there to be contributors into the modern world. But they see the modern world all around them. In these societies, like Somalia, there are more cell phones than there are people. They know what's going on, and this expectation gap compared to their own existence is dramatic. And it's frightening to them, and you have to understand the people in these cultures and what drives them. And they are fearful, they desire things, you have to understand their motivations, their concerns, their fears, their desires, and then how they identify. And increasingly, because of the dynamics that are going on, they don't identify as a national identity, Nigerian, Syrian, or Iraqi. Increasingly, the identity is born of sectarian, communal identity, religious identity, tribal identity, or ethnic identity. And that leads to fracture, and it breaks the cohesion of the societies. And that's directly related to the lack of political inclusive governance and the delivery of services, the fraying of the social contract between those who are ruled and those who rule. And that's what the Arab Spring was all about, and it failed. And we're going to get into that. But this is a very pessimistic thing here, okay? So, some security trends in the region. They're breaking down. The United States has been disengaging from the region, and the region understands that. And in that void, others exert themselves. And then outside powers also try to influence through their proxies. And so that balance of power and the stability that had been there is fraying. And we're going to continue to see that fray over the next decade until you find some new balance. And hopefully it comes sooner rather than later. But that's a challenge that the State Department, European Union, European allies, and those countries in the region are grappling with. And they're fearful too. The Saudis are fearful. Others are fearful in the region about what this means for them. and it drives their decisions at the state level. International competition, all of these countries are involved in cross-cutting issues. So if you're looking at Syria, it is not just Syria, it is Russia backing Syria, it's Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon backing Syria. And on the other side, you have Turkey, the Gulf monarchies, primarily Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and the United States playing in the sandbox a little bit of Syria. And then there's the cross-cutting issues, because we need Russian support for a nuclear deal with Iran. We need Iranian support for our efforts in Iraq against the Islamic State, and we want a nuclear deal, yet we're on opposite sides in Syria. And I could go on with every one of these countries, depending upon the issue, about these cross-cutting, conflicting issues to try and bring collaboration. That's why it's going to be so hard for the president to have a coalition, because no one agrees with anybody about the bucket of issues. And then in the region, a rebirth of nationalism. And we've seen that with Russia. We see it with China in the South China Sea, pushing. Iran trying to expand its sphere of influence. India flexing its muscles. And Pakistan. And then it's aggravated by subnational movements. And technology, social media, and identity is enhanced with technology and communication. And we see this in Pakistan, Iraq, but we have an election today where the Scots are voting for independence. You have this Basque movement in Spain. You have a separatist movement. Just about every country in Europe has some element looking for some autonomy or some change in the status quo. So this creates instability, and it's going on in most of the countries in the Middle East in one way or another. Iran is not immune to this, with Baluchis and Kurds looking for autonomy. Just as an example. And the Middle East has for a long time suffered from political decay and challenges to governance and the social contract that I've talked about. And we've had authoritarian leaders for decades. But they did bring stability. And the question earlier tonight was, weren't we better off with Saddam Hussein? At least he kept things under control. Same thing with Mubarak and the same thing with Gaddafi. But they also suppressed and prevented civil society from emerging and developing. And those that tried to emerge and have a voice were pushed into the mosque and into Islamic movements, and the rest of society, and learning how to deal collaboratively with each other and work together as a community, it was undermined. So the Arab Spring failed and petered out in country after country except for Tunisia. And so we have post-Arab Spring turmoil, and the most emblematic country for that is Syria today with the civil war. And the authoritarian rebound is there, and there's going to be a fight in the future because that suppressed class, the youth bulge, the demographic change, they're still going to want change in the future. So how is that going to play out? And interestingly enough, the monarchs in the Gulf, in Jordan, and in Morocco did not suffer the consequences that the other authoritarian leaders did, because they did have a sense of the pulse of the people, and they did try to engage. They poured money into it in some cases, but they can deliver something. They deliver governance, they deliver services, so they deliver part of the bargain, but not the whole bargain. So they're still hanging on, but they're threatened. And then the underlying current throughout the Middle East, and this can be touchy, but there is a sectarian conflict going on. And it's at a couple of levels. It's Shia versus Sunni at the grassroots level. Not all Shia and not all Sunni. I was explaining about a friend of mine, Mithal al-Lusi. He had 5 sons killed by Shia militias. Yet he is still working to bring the communal Shia and Sunni communities together, because he believes in Iraq and he believes in his country. And I see it on the Shias, and I see the cooperation there. So this is not everybody. But the extremists there are pushing, and pushing. And we see that with the Islamic State. We see it with Al-Qaeda. We see it with other groups, Shia militias too. And they're fighting about minority majority and power and influence, and they're driven by an ideology. But it's also infected by a geopolitical competition between Saudi Arabia and Sunni Islam on one level and Iran on the other. And this intersects with these populations, and it plays out in the battlefields of Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq today. And even Pakistan and Afghanistan are not immune to the Shia-Sunni conflict because we see plenty of episodic violence there too. And then there's another fight going on, and this is within the Sunni community, a conflict with what I call the Takfiri Salafi annihilationists, who are willing to tear everything down and no one else is legitimate except them. And they're intolerant, and they have a view of Islam that goes back to the 600s of the days of Muhammad, and they are uncompromising. And within this conflict, you have Al-Qaeda fighting the Islamic State for the lead of the jihadist community. And then you also have Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and others taking issue and fighting establishment community leaders, be they religious leaders or political leaders, saying they're going to tear down the kingdom in Jordan, and they're going to occupy and take back Medina and Mecca, and they're going to take Jerusalem. This is what we're seeing, and these are the undercurrents. And the picture is just the before and after of the violence. And they're destroying mosques of the other side, historical places, tearing down Christian churches, blowing them up. And this is an annihilationist agenda to wipe out everything about the culture and the past that competes with their idea of Muhammad and their faith. And Syria, the Syrian civil war sort of encapsulates all of this, okay? It's part of a wider regional conflict that goes from the Mediterranean all the way to Pakistan. Iran, Hezbollah, Iraq, Russia are providing the key support. And by the way, the picture is a city street in Aleppo 3 years ago and today. And this is in city after city, village after village. And that is why we have nearly 200,000 people killed in 3+ years, 9 million internally displaced peoples, families, children with no schools, no infrastructure, internally displaced, and 3 million displaced outside of the country. 2 million in Jordan alone, which is the equivalent of every person in Canada coming to the United States with nothing and we being asked to provide everything for them. That's what it is like relatively. And it's drawing on Westerners, 2,000 Westerners from Western Europeans from about 50 countries. 9,000 foreign fighters, 2,000 Western Europeans, okay? And this is a reflection of the draw of the Islamic State's message that is penetrating Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia, around the world. So this Islamic State, and that's Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi giving a sermon in Mosul on the top, and that's the map of the Islamic State, that's what they're aspiring to, and that's Bashar al-Assad on the bottom. And these regional crises and the competitions in the region, these trends are all feeding off each other in Syria. It's a witch's brew, as Janine Davidson said last night on the NewsHour. And the subnational pressures are increasingly focusing people on these lower level identities. And when your life is in crisis, where do you go to for support? You go to your church, your family, your extended family, your community. That's what's happening here. Your identity doesn't look up and out, it looks down and in, okay? And so the root causes here, as in most of the region, security, governance, institutional capacity, economic and education. This is the rebound from the failure of the Arab Spring. He decided to squash it as a minority element who wasn't delivering for the people, and this is what we get. So, I'm shifting gears a little bit. What are we doing about it? And we're going to treat the symptom. Very briefly, this is the strategy against the Islamic State, which is a binational threat to us. Major lines of effort are to focus on going after their finances and those that trade and support them, going after foreign fighter networks across the world that feed into the fight, and those that are going out so we can monitor and track them. Part of it is the bombing campaign that is very limited to date. Build a coalition, delegitimize the Islamic State. And that's nothing the United States can do. But you have to go after their core brand. And that brand of Islam is unacceptable. And the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, the Egyptians, other Muslims throughout the world need to come together to disenfranchise that interpretation of Islam for the modern world. A humanitarian effort to help repair and rebuild and assist and to coordinate where we can, and then build alliances with Sunni Arab tribes in both Syria and Iraq, because it has to be Sunni Arabs that take the fight to the Islamic State. At the end of the day, it was the Sunni Arabs that did it, 120,000 of them in 2007 and 2008, that did it in the surge under General Petraeus. That was the difference maker. It wasn't our 160,000. We made a tremendous effort, but the difference maker was when the local communities rose up and said, I'm taking my life back, I'm taking my community back. And the last piece is the long-term thing of building, training, and equipping security forces, once again, that are going to be politically inclusive and fair in their adjudication of their roles in their societies. Prime Minister Maliki broke what he was handed by the United States by making it a sectarian force and removing professional officers, both Sunni and Shia, and replacing them with sectarian-driven leaders who were not competent. And we saw the result when that Iraqi army dissolved. So what are we going to see going into the future? We're going to be riding the tiger, okay? And that's not a fun ride. And we're going to be cutting the grass because these violent groups are going to keep rising again. We're going to have to keep cutting the grass because the underlying environment's going to keep producing them. Shifting security construct, disengagement will have to be managed. These demographic, population, and other trends I talked about are going to continue to aggravate and exacerbate the situation. We need to think seriously about it. These are major issues: governance, economics, and political crises across the land. Arab-Israeli issues, Iranian nuclear issues, Iran, Gulf competition. These issues will continue to fester. Breakups of nations are highly likely. I doubt we're going to get Syria back together again. Okay? And some people doubt Iraq, but I think Iraq has a much better opportunity than Syria does because no one can really figure out Syria at this point. And some are worried that we're going to see decades-long struggle because how do you put this back together? And it's going to take an international concerted effort of those within the region as well as those without, and hard decisions have to be made. So our U.S. interests, what does it mean? And how do we get involved? To the right in the blue box, we're mostly concerned about security, mainly terrorism, global trade in oil, and humanitarian issues and values. But those are the things that our government says we're interested in the Middle East. Our interests in how we engage is a reflection of our governance system, our political system. Our elections matter. We elect representatives. The election process is influenced by people that get mobilized, interest groups, businesses, and the like. And we elect leaders. If we would have had Al Gore as president in 2001 rather than George W. Bush, our response would have been different. If we had Senator McCain as president today instead of President Obama, our response to ISIS would be different. People do matter. And so we have to keep that in mind. So how we engage is a reflection of how the American public responds and our leaders responding to that pressure. We got involved in Iraq again. The tipping point was not our interests, not these other things. It was the Yazidi genocide, the media hype over that, and the international community asking for U.S. leadership because The world still sees the United States as the indispensable nation. And rightly or wrongly, for good or worse, we have a role, and the American public can be driven by what they see, especially when their hearts are touched. So U.S. leadership remains critical. The question is, how will we engage in the world? Can we do it smartly? And in order to engage in the world, you need knowledge, you need insight, you need to go back to what I talked about in the beginning. Do we understand the currents that are going through the region? Can we articulate and define what it is that we're going to try and achieve? Is it doable? Do we have the resources and the political will to do it? These are all tough questions that our leaders are dealing with, and we need to consider. So with that, I'm prepared to answer any questions you want about the Islamic State or other issues that were briefly touched on here. I know I ran through this fairly quickly. There's a lot to digest. And I will, if you ask a question, I will then repeat the question so everyone can hear it. Shock and awe, huh? Let me get a drink of water in the process. I ran through that without taking a sip. Yes, yes. The question is, what do I think should be our next step in Syria? Well, that's a hard one. I believe that there are significant opportunities in southeast Syria to build a Sunni Arab awakening-like movement there, and in the northeast of Syria. And the Islamic State in Syria is significantly weaker than many people think they are. And I think if we were to hit them with a well-planned strategic air campaign that is connected to some direct action, that we could really break their backs at their capital in Raqqa and set them on their heels. I think we do need to find some partner there if we're going to stick with the idea that we're not going to work with Iran and we're not going to change our position vis-a-vis Bashar al-Assad. And the reasons for not changing our position with Bashar al-Assad, although you might think it would make sense, is the UN report says he's committed far more atrocities and caused far more deaths and is more brutal than what ISIS has been in that environment. And it's hard for this administration and for many in the American public to accept the idea of partnering with a regime like that. So there are no good choices with Syria, and that's the fundamental dilemma. You can pick at it, you can move it, but if we're not going to use troops, and I don't advise putting troops in there. Matter of fact, I really don't have a good answer for Syria, okay? It is the conundrum. It is the piece of this, and I made this point the other day on TV, but I also made it in Washington. We do not have an end game for Syria. We don't have anything to offer them politically for those that would come on our side. We don't have a partner in the government. We don't have a good partner with the Free Syrian Army. And trying to find the moderate, there are 50 plus different insurgent groups there, okay? But the one weakness for the Islamic State is they're stretched very thin, and across most of the land, they have coerced alliances, and there's a lot of opposition to them at the grassroots level. So how can you mobilize that? That's the question that we haven't figured out. And I think that's turning Sunni Arab against Sunni Arab in that case. And it has to be a combined operation, though, both in Iraq and in Syria, and it's going to take time. And all those things I laid out, that's about constricting and pressing and realizing it's going to take time. And the president could be better at articulating the need that this is going to really take time to build the coalition and to shape that environment and to squeeze them. And, you know, getting Turkey on board would be a big plus, but Turkey has been clearly in opposition to doing the right things in order to have an effect on the Islamic State for a number of reasons. Yes, sir.
What do you think the chances are within the next 3 years that ISIL or ISIS will exports terrorism to the U.S.?
What do I think the chances are the Islamic State will export terrorism to the United States? They have the capability and they have the intent to do just that. What we don't know is the who, what, where, when, and how they would do it. In working on the Al-Qaeda problem set prior to 9/11, we had the same questions. We knew there was intent and capability. We did not know who, what, where, when, and how. And we thought it would probably be in the Gulf. No one thought it was going to be here in the United States. So anybody who says that we don't have evidence, we don't have indicators, well, we didn't have the indicators that would be in the United States on September 10th, 2001 either. I think they have more things to worry about right now on one hand in establishing governance and control over their own areas. But there are two major concerns. They want to break the back of Zawahiri's leadership of Al-Qaeda and the jihadist movement, and one way of doing that is striking Western Europe and the U.S. homeland. And so that is part of their intent. So that's a critical thing. And two, they have got something that Al-Qaeda never had. They've got thousands of Western passport holders. They've recruited people from the Minneapolis airport that had secret clearances that were working for the Transportation Security Agency, okay? Fortunately, they died over there rather than being an inside job at the Minneapolis airport. So they've got penetration and reach by virtue of their sophisticated recruitment campaign, which is primarily through chat rooms and social media. But they also have an extensive mosque-based network that is primarily in Africa and South Asia and increasingly in Asia. So this is the Islamic State, and it is expanding and taking a leadership role, and Al-Qaeda is being overtaken. Yes, sir?
I mean, the Islamic State was a non-entity not so long ago. Now it is being funded, it's being armed, and it's become a very source of evil power. Who is funding it there, and who is arming them? I mean, you know, there has to be some place that they are getting their arms and getting their finances.
Well, that's an interesting question, but who is the Islamic State? Islamic State is almost overwhelmingly at the senior levels former Iraqi mukhabarat, or intelligence service officers, and general officers of those types that we either captured and held for some time, or some that we never did capture. The military leadership is entirely Iraqi military and former intelligence. Okay, so that's important. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is a doctor of Islamic studies from Baghdad University. And he is a very astute, smart guy, and he was grown up through the Al-Qaeda network in Iraq. And the social media network and the religious base is based on Gulf monarchy-sourced individuals. And we know a lot about who these people are, and I know who their finance guys are, etc. And they are really smart, capable people. Now, the interesting thing is only 5% of their funding stream comes from donations from the Gulf and outside the area. They were generating, in 2013, $8 million a month from Nineveh province through taxes and extortion. Their campaign that they launched earlier this summer was the result of a shaping operation that was conceived 18 months ago to undermine, coerce the infrastructure, the security forces, and governance. And they did it like termites, just eroding and eroding and intimidating. So when they did launch, it collapsed. And Prime Minister Maliki's actions contributed to that because the leaders he had up there were very sectarian and they weren't very competent. And when the leaders fled, the soldiers dissipated. They've had oil and gas, and the Syrian government led by Bashar al-Assad has been buying the gas and oil from the Islamic State. And the Syrian government has refused, for the most part, over the last 3 years to attack the Islamic State because they want to make this a false choice between you either are with Bashar al-Assad, who, hey, you all know me and love me, I'm a better choice than these thugs over here. That's the choice he's trying to make. So he has not attacked them, and he's traded with them, and he's released prisoners and directed them to the Islamic State. And he's focused his efforts on the Free Syrian Army and some of the other groups. Not only oil and gas, but then trading, commercial enterprises, and then they charge taxes because they have an education department, they have transportation department, they have all the makings of a government. And that's how they get their money. Their armaments, quite a few of their armaments come through Turkey. Some of they have captured and taken from some of the other insurgent groups, many from Syrian military facilities. And then they got the mother lode when they ran in, and they very carefully went after each base. And they knew what was at the bases, and they knew how to get them out of there quickly. They had the heavy lift movers. They knew which banks to go to. They knew what to expect because their intelligence was impeccable. This is a sophisticated, competent organization fighting on its own turf. And when they went in, they had support from the Naqshbandis, JRTN, the Iraqi Islamic Army, and other groups, because they were also angered with the administration in Baghdad. And so this was, in part, a Sunni Arab resistance initially, and now they're starting to realize they've made a bargain with the devil. But it might be too late for many of them. Yes, sir, all the way in the back.
Gulf War, the most stable part of Iraq has been the northeast, Kurdistan, if you will. Why not make an alliance with Kurdistan and use that as a base of operations to take care of the problems with ISIL and the other neighboring areas?
Okay, Kurdistan has been the most stable part of Iraq. Why not make an alliance with Kurdistan and use that as a base of operations from which to project force and deal with the ISIL problem? In some ways, that's what we're doing. That's where a task force command headquarters is located in Erbil. France, Germany, and the UK primarily, and some CIA activities are providing small arms, munitions, and crew-served weapons to try and uplift the Peshmerga capabilities. But the Peshmerga are going to be resistant to pushing out into Sunni Arab communities because they do not want to cause that kind of a fight. They recognize the extent of their boundaries, okay? And so they're not an offensive force. They're not a force that can project. They don't have the mobility, they don't have air power, they don't have those things. We've made a pact with the Baghdad government where they have acquiesced to the arming of the Peshmerga because of necessity. And that alliance is part, you can call it an alliance, that partnership is there. And you're right, it is the most stable and prosperous part of the country, and for good reason. But, you know, I think that answers that question. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that this is also an internal conflict among the Sunnis. What role do you see Saudi Arabia playing in this crisis? And is Saudi's military capable, or are they a paper tiger with dirty, shiny new weapons?
What is the role of Saudi Arabia in this internal Sunni crisis? And what role could Saudi Arabia play with its military capabilities and other diplomatic, economic capabilities to influence, I think is what you're asking. Are they a paper tiger? I'll take a step back. In looking at Twitter traffic, Facebook, etc. of Saudi Arabia is per capita the #1 user of Twitter, for example. And 45% of Twitter communication is about the United States in one way or the other, and it's overwhelmingly negative. And there's tremendous empathy and sympathy for the Islamic State because it is fighting against Shia. It is breaking down these borders that were imposed on the Arab nation through Sykes-Picot, and a reflection of frustration with the United States for Arab-Israeli issues and the Gaza campaign that just occurred, and that generated a lot more frustration in the traffic. The kingdom is very sensitive to those things. The other thing is Saudi Arabian capabilities employed in either Iraq or Syria is problematic because neither country wants them there. And it's part of that Iran, Turkey, Gulf, Cold War that is very sensitive. So that's very problematic. The other thing is, frankly, I don't think they're very good, okay, at projecting force. And they don't want to project force, and the coalition for this air campaign is based upon them providing basing, fuel, AWACS support, intelligence. But none of the countries are offering up strike capabilities to go in and hit in either Syria or in Iraq. And neither of those countries are going to accept it. And we have some other issues at play here, too. Don't you think we might need or want a UN approval for an intervention? An international legal mechanism to allow you to do it? I mean, there are international norms and regimes that we need to think about, and Russia and China both said that they're going to veto anything. And these issues also play into this dialogue here about how the Gulfies are going to play. So paper tiger is how I'd look at it, and we can't count on them. But where we should count on them is in this idea of delegitimizing the Islamic State, because we really can't do that. That's a narrative that we do not have the ability to engage in. Yes, sir?
What do you see as the prospects for any resolution of Israeli and Palestinian situation?
What are the prospects for the Israeli-Palestinian situation?
I think many of the Islamic countries and Muslims see as America completely supporting Israel, unlimited land question. And that may be resulting to a lot of problems here. So I don't see any resolution because since the beginning, we had East-West conflict, which was resolved. Then there was South Africa, it was resolved. But Israel and Palestine situation still continues to this day. So
what do we see in the prospects for the Arab-Israeli situation, given that it's such an aggravator and it is such a focus for the communities in the region? I used to work the Arab-Israeli desk, and it's not a fun desk to work, okay? And it's not a portfolio you really want if you're in state or other places either, because it's very unsatisfying. You're right, the U.S. perception of the U.S. is that we are very one-sided, and it does aggravate. I do not think it's determinant. It is an aggravator, and it affects our ability to influence and the perception of the U.S. It hits us in every way. But most of these other issues are not related at all to that. They're related to fundamentals of governance, civil society, rule of law, political inclusion, etc. Frankly, I'm pessimistic about any real change until those that have the hardline positions in both Israel and Gaza can find a way to move closer to the middle. And I don't see that happening without real political change in either of those situations. It's full of emotion. Perception matters. Israel is increasingly perceived as being isolated in the world, and those things are probably going to have an influence on the Israeli politic over time. One might think that. On the other hand, there's a movement towards digging their heels in even more as certain groups are really increasing their influence in the political system. A small discussion about that earlier tonight, and I don't think it's going to be resolved in my lifetime. Yes, sir.
Jay First, Foreign Service Officer, 19, in terms of native percentage you're talking about. And I have a question about Afghanistan. So, took flights 60, 62, 70,
So he served in Afghanistan twice. He has a question about Afghanistan, and he served in most of the region in one way or another as a Foreign Service officer.
And I wanted to ask you about, what do you think about the situation in Afghanistan now? The outcome of doing positive, settle up, go on.
What do I think about the situation in Afghanistan now? And Pakistan continues to support the Taliban and Pashtun elements that are against the central government. And until Pakistan shifts gears, we're going to have a real hard time ending the violence and the disruptions in that society. But the Afghan National Security Forces and governance capability has increased tremendously over the 13 years. The society that is there today is really much different from what it was in 2001 in terms of education, economic activity, etc. But they're in no way prepared to stand on their own. They don't have the economic resources, the development to do that, and they cannot fund and support their Afghan National Security Forces, to sustain them without outside assistance. And they need some enablers like technology and training and some hand-holding still going forward. But the good things about the Afghan National Security Forces is that they will fight. They have the will, and they have the basic capabilities, and they are winning the fights against the Taliban for the most part, except in some isolated areas. So that's the good news. But the larger problem right now is how do we transition from President Karzai and resolve this political stalemate of this unresolved election between Abdullah on one hand and Ashraf Ghani on the other. And I've been looking at the numbers. I've written some editorials on this, and I'm fairly convinced that Ashraf Ghani did in fact win the election, but there was corruption on both sides. And the margin would have been much smaller, but Ashraf Ghani, in my view, did win. But Abdullah has the support of the Northern Alliance and Mohammed Atta in particular, and they are absolutely adamant that they're going to secure at least a co-presidency. And that's where the problem is. And are we going to support the resolution of the election by virtue of this recount that's been monitored by the United Nations and let the winner win? Or are we going to allow it to be held hostage by the thuggery of Mohammed Atta and the warlords of the North working through Abdullah? That seems to me to be the fundamental question. And are we going to support that political process of the election for all its foibles? Or is there going to be some other resolution? And this could break the country apart if it doesn't get resolved. And that's the first thing we have to get through. Then it's about the U.S. withdrawing and what will actually stay behind and how much international support can be orchestrated to continue to fund. It's one of those countries that has still got that population youth bulge, and it can unhinge a lot of the region, including Pakistan, with spillover. Yes?
A lot of the problems seem to be caused by is trying to get away from it, and it's falling apart.
What do I think about the president withdrawing and wanting to pull out quicker and the risk of things falling apart? Well, the president ran on a campaign that said he was going to pull out of the Iraq War and these other places. The question is, how do you do it, and can you do it smartly without losing ground? And I think we lost ground, and a smaller investment over a longer period of time, I think, could have prevented what we've seen happen in Iraq today. Serious political engagement to push Maliki to do things that he didn't want to do, but being engaged there with some force structure to push back on some of the malign agendas of the administration. And fundamentally, we did make some bad decisions about Maliki years ago, in retrospect, but that's 20/20 hindsight. we have the risk of pulling out prematurely in Afghanistan and it collapsing too. And so how much do you want to invest? And the president, you know, I've talked to senators like McGaskill and others, and they're ready to come home, okay? They want money spent on bridges and things here. We've got enough problems here. So there's this push and pull between an isolationist, maybe not isolationist, but we don't have the effect. We're not successful. Why are we over there? Those are the types of questions you get. And I think we've overpromised a lot. And David and I have talked about this a lot. We've used a lot of aspirational language, talking about building democracies, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And we oversold what we were going to do in places like Afghanistan. It was never realistic to do the things that we said we were going to do. And so we need to take appetite suppressants in framing what it is that we're thinking about doing, okay? And let's put it back in the box of what is realistic. And I always use this term, what is an acceptable outcome? Okay? For now, given where we're at as a country, what our resources are, what we're willing to invest, and how we can keep the American public on side. And the American public is on side if they see success. They quickly come off the rails if they see a major gap between rhetoric and reality, and they think they've been sold a bill of goods, and that we're really not committed to achieving something, and that our contributions are not appreciated. That's what happens, okay? So none of this is easy. And my classes, I teach a class on intervention, and what's going on in the world. We've shifted the class to discussing the ISIS situation in Iraq and Syria. It's a living experiment for them. And it's a very dynamic thing, but none of this is easy. It's ambiguous, it's complex, and there are no right answers at the end of the day in many of these places. You just have to take bites out of the apple. And with that, I'll end, sir.
Well, lots and lots to think about there. Those last few comments, Derek, about overpromising is really interesting. There's this vocabulary that comes out of a time when we didn't think about limits and interdependence the same way we do today. And it's almost like we need to develop a different vocabulary and aesthetic for thinking about what's possible, you know. Anyway, I thought that was absolutely amazing. Thank you all for being here.